All right, so looks like we're going way back in time for this deep dive. Back to 2016 with the Coolpad Note 3 Plus.
Yeah.
We've got this review from RechargeMyTopup.com. It was published a lot later in February 2023.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting, to look back at what had work.
Considered a good budget phone back then.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It really gives you a sense of how far the technology has come in. Just less than a decade.
Yeah, and the review actually jumps right into the specs. 5.5-inch full HD display, octa-core processor, 3 gigs of RAM. Not bad for a budget phone in 2016, right?
Yeah, especially back then, that was pretty decent for
an affordable phone.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But the thing that really stands out to me is the fingerprint sensor. You didn't see that on every budget phone back then, did you?
No, not at all. That was definitely a feature that make a phone stand out, especially in that price range.
So you're saying like this phone was kind of a big deal when it came out?
It had the potential to be, yeah. Especially considering the price point. But the specs don't tell the whole story. I'm curious to see what the review says about, the actual performance and user experience.
Yeah, for sure. Well, they do point out that it was running Android 5.1 Lollipop, which even in 2016 was starting to get a little bit dated. Like, wouldn't that have limited the phone's capabilities?
Yeah.
Even back then.
Well, you have to remember, in 2016, Lollipop was an ancient history. But yeah, it was a couple versions behind the latest Android release. So the question is, how much did that impact the actual user experience?
Right, yeah, it's all about like what people were expecting from their phones back then. But I mean, like today, running a version of Android that old would be a deal breaker for a lot of people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about app compatibility, security updates, even just like battery management. Newer versions of Android just brought so many improvements to all of those areas.
Yeah.
So using a phone with an operating system that old,
yeah,
I really feel like, taking a step back in time, in a bad way.
So even if the Coolpad Note 3 Plus had some cool features, that outdated software might held it back.
Yeah, it's definitely something to consider. And speaking of features, the review also mentions the phone had kind of a mediocre selfie camera, which, that's got to be a tough pill to swallow for the selfie generation.
Oh, definitely not a selling point these days. But I guess in 2016, camera technology wasn't as advanced as it is now, so maybe what was considered acceptable then seems pretty underwhelming by today's standards.
Exactly. Back then, a lot of budget phones struggled to take decent photos in general, let alone good selfies. But beyond just megapixels, the advancements in computational photography have really been a game changer.
Computational photography, what is that exactly?
So basically, it's using software to enhance the capabilities of the camera hardware. So things like combining multiple exposures, using AI to recognize scenes and adjust the settings, even creating those portrait mode effects with the blurred backgrounds. All of that is driven by computational photography.
Wow, so it's not even just about the lens and the sensor anymore. It's about how the software processes the image data.
Exactly, and that's something that has advanced so much since 2016. So now even budget smartphones are capable of taking really incredible photos.
So while the Coolpad Note 3 Plus might not have been a selfie superstar, it's important to view it in the context of its time. And, hey, maybe it had other redeeming qualities. Let's not judge a phone by its selfie camera alone.
Yeah, you're right. Let's dig a little deeper and see what else this phone had to offer.
So, okay, maybe the selfie camera wasn't its best feature, but the review does mention a few other things, like the design, for example, metal frame, textured back. It also mentions some software features, like guest mode and smart control.
Yeah, those are some nice touches.
Yeah.
Especially for a budget phone. It shows that Coolpad was thinking about, the whole user experience, not just focusing on specs.
So even back then, like, manufacturers were realizing that design and software features were important for how people experience a phone.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a phone could have the most powerful processor, but if it's uncomfortable to hold or the software is clunky, it's not going to be enjoyable to use.
Right, totally. Speaking of design, what about the build quality of this phone? Was it sturdy or did it feel kind of cheap?
Well, the review doesn't say too much about that. It mentions the metal frame, which probably made it pretty solid. And the textured back probably helped with grip, but without actually using it. It's hard to say for sure how well it held up.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about those software features, guest mode and smart control? Were those common on budget phones back then?
Guest mode was becoming more popular. People were starting to share their phones more, and they wanted to protect their privacy. Smart control, I'm guessing that means like gesture controls. Yeah. That was less common, but it's definitely innovative for a budget phone.
So even though this phone had some limitations, it seems like Coolpad was trying to push the boundaries a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good example of how innovation starts at the high end and then trickles down to more affordable phones. Features that were once considered premium become standard over time.
That's really interesting. It makes you wonder, like, what features we think are normal today that will seem outdated in a few years.
Exactly, like think about wireless charging or high refresh rate displays, even having multiple camera lenses. Those are all pretty standard now. But who knows what the next big thing will be?
Okay, so we've talked about the specs, the software, the camera, the design, but what about the performance? Did it actually work well?
Well, the review says it performed well for its time. It can handle everyday tasks, like browsing social media, light gaming, without any problems. But of course, people's expectations were different back then.
Right, like there was no Fortnite or anything.
Exactly. But it's still impressive that a budget phone from 2016 could keep up with everything.
So overall, it sounds like the Coolpad Note 3 Plus was a pretty decent phone for its time. Maybe not amazing, but it offered a solid experience for the price.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. It reminds us that not everyone needs the most expensive flagship phone. Sometimes a budget phone is all you need.
That's a good point. It's all about finding the right tool for the job. And sometimes that tool doesn't have to be fancy. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about when it comes to evaluating smartphones, both old and new. What do you say we shift gears a little bit and talk about what really matters in a smartphone today?
Yeah, let's bring the conversation into the present and see what features people are looking for now.
Okay, so we've gone back in time with this Coolpad phone, seen how budget phones have evolved over the years. But now I'm curious, like, what are the must-haves in a smartphone today? Fingerprint sensors are pretty much standard now, but what else is on that list?
Well, camera quality is still a huge factor, and it's not just about megapixels anymore. People want a main camera that can take great photos, a wide-angle lens for group shots, maybe even a telephoto lens for zooming.
Right. Everyone wants to be a photographer these days. What about the selfie camera? Is that still important?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Social media is all about self-expression. So a good front-facing camera is essential for those selfies and video calls.
Okay, so cameras are important, but what about the processor? How much does processing power matter?
It's definitely crucial, especially with how demanding apps are these days. People are multitasking gaming, doing all sorts of things on their phones. But it's not just about speed. You also need efficiency, a powerful processor that doesn't drain the battery too fast.
Oh yeah, battery life. That's a big one for me. What are people expecting these days?
People want their phones to last all day on a single charge. And fast charging is becoming more and more important too. Nobody wants to wait hours for their phone to charge.
So basically a modern smartphone needs to be a real workhorse. It's not just for making calls anymore. It's our camera, our entertainment system, our everything.
Pretty much, yeah. And as we rely on our smartphones more and more, those expectations are only going to increase.
Well, this deep dive has been really interesting. We started by looking at this budget phone from 2016, and now we're talking about the features that define a modern smartphone. It's amazing how quickly technology changes.
It really is.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what the future holds. What new innovations will we see? How will they change the way we use our phones?
That's a great question, and something to think about. We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's always more to explore. So until next time, keep diving into the world of tech, and let us know what features why you consider essential in a smartphone. We'd love to hear your thoughts.